Since the war broke out in Iran, almost all the news around the world has been about a single waterway. But no matter how important that issue is, it's not the only maritime event we should be watching right now. In fact, there's another story quietly unfolding in the East China Sea, and it could be just as significant, if not even more important. On March 13, the AFP news agency released the results of an investigation. According to this, since Christmas Day of 2025, thousands of Chinese fishing vessels have gathered in the East China Sea. They didn't just gather, they formed geometric formations that seemed planned and moved in unison. According to experts, this could be part of Beijing's preparations for a possible crisis or tension in the region. According to Jason Wang, Chief Operating Officer of Space, a company that analyzes satellite images and ship signal data, something unusual is really happening. He told AFP that you can immediately see that the situation is not normal because thousands of boats are positioned in two parallel inverted L shapes, each of which is about 400 kilometers long. The ships are only about 500 meters apart from each other, staying in their positions for almost 30 hours, even with strong winds, almost typhoon strength. And then, suddenly, they just disappear. According to him, something seemed off to me because in nature, it's rare to see a perfectly straight line. We've seen 200, 300, up to 1,000 Chinese fishing boats gathering together. But when it goes beyond 1,000, that's when it becomes unusual. Jennifer Parker, a former Australian naval warfare officer, also told AFP that she has never seen the fishing vessels moving that close to each other. Some might say, maybe that's just where there are a lot of fish. But with the amount of evidence, it's clear that what's happening in the East China Sea needs to be closely examined. And whatever is happening there should be a cause for concern for everyone. But before we start, if you're new to our channel, make sure to subscribe so you'll always be updated with videos like this. Straight lines, 1.5 million. That's the number of ships passing through the South China Sea every year. And according to Joe Wilkins of Futurism, their movements are usually chaotic. When you look at the GPS data, it looks more like a scatter plot with points scattered around rather than neat lines on a graph. But the Chinese vessels showed the opposite pattern. Their movements are like constellations in the sky. Organized, the formation is clear and noticeable. That's why it immediately caught the attention of experts in the region. And this didn't just happen once. According to a report by the New York Times on January 11, the ships formed a very tight rectangular formation, so close together that some incoming cargo ships were forced to avoid or zigzag just to get through. They did this again in March. According to Wang of AFP, it's around 1,200. They positioned themselves in two parallel lines even farther east compared to the previous incidents in December and January. And they stayed there for almost 30 hours. Now, the biggest question is why? To understand this, we need to mention a very important detail. The ships that gathered in the East China Sea are part of what is called the Chinese Maritime Militia, which many analysts consider as China's third maritime force, aside from their Navy and Coast Guard. According to Newsweek, Beijing claims that this group is simply an association of patriotic fishermen. Let's just say it's simple, but in reality, they are often used in operations by the Chinese Coast Guard, including blockading a Philippine military outpost in the Spratly Islands. And their role doesn't end there. They have long been used to assert China's territorial claims in the region. They were involved in the seizure of the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam in 1974, the harassment of a U.S. Navy surveillance vessel in 2009, and the tensions at Scarborough Shoal with the Philippines in 2012. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, there are two main types of maritime militia. First, there are the purpose-built professional ships, vessels specifically made for this mission and sufficiently funded by the government. Second, there are the ordinary fishing boats that are recruited through subsidies. The professional ships usually have water cannons and reinforced hulls. Meanwhile, the fishermen who are recruited are civilians who are given military training and can be called up at any time like reservists on land. Now, why is all of this important? Because according to AIS data analyzed by Gregory Pauling of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS, most of the ships come from the eastern province of Zhejiang, a place known as a stronghold of the Maritime Militia. And according to Pauling, these activities are like a test. Beijing is testing how quickly the militia can assemble and whether they can carry out the missions assigned to them, and this is where the situation becomes more serious. According to Thomas Schuggart, a former U.S. Navy submarine officer, civilian ships are very important to China's plan in case there is an operation against Taiwan, which is only about 300 kilometers away from the location of these incidents. The Chinese Navy's landing vessels are not enough to carry all the troops and equipment needed for a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. Without the capability to gather and deploy a large number of civilian ships, an amphibious operation in the Taiwan Strait would remain almost impossible for Beijing. But if they have this capability, the situation changes slightly and the advantage shifts a bit to their side. Jennifer Parker agreed with this, saying that China's plan for operations around Taiwan includes using maritime militia as a force multiplier. This means it strengthens their capabilities without having to rely solely on regular military forces. Aside from testing whether the militia is ready for a possible invasion of Taiwan, these activities could also be a way for Beijing to demonstrate its power in the region. Because think about it, a massive fleet of ships, perfectly organized, staying in position, even with near storm level winds and covering hundreds of kilometers, that alone is already a clear message. This shows every country in the region that Beijing is more than capable to organize and deploy civilian ships at a scale and speed that even some modern navies would struggle to match. And what's even more surprising, they can do this without even deploying a single warship. Another reason why some experts believe this is a form of power projection is the timing of the events. While the initial formations happened in December and January, the most recent one took place in March, at the same time as the war in Iran. And that's important because in February, just days before the attacks began, China conducted naval exercises with Iran and Russia in the Strait of Hormuz, a demonstration of Iran's ability to control that vital oil passage. But when the war broke out, it seemed that Beijing pulled back. Instead of direct intervention, they limited themselves to strong statements and diplomatic condemnations, as if saying, "You can handle it on your own." But if you look closely, there's logic behind this move. China doesn't want to anger the US and the Gulf countries, which are very important to their economy. But because of this, some started to ask, is Beijing really ready to support its allies? And beyond that, just how strong is their military capability? For a country that wants to be recognized as a global superpower and a direct rival of Washington, this kind of image is dangerous. So the sudden gathering of thousands of ships, exactly at a time when the world is focused on the Strait of Hormuz, could be a clear reminder that Beijing's influence is not just talk, and they can show their power anytime, anywhere in the world. Now, it's important to note that Beijing has not yet given any official explanation about these formations. This means that all explanations are only based on the analysis and opinions of experts. Possible, but not confirmed. But whatever the real reason is, it's clear that this has a significant impact. And this didn't happen just anywhere in some distant part of the sea. It happened near the main shipping lanes from Shanghai, one of the busiest ports in the world. As mentioned earlier, on January 11, the formation was so tight that cargo ships had to avoid and zigzag just to get through. And in the world of commercial shipping, every hour is critical, schedules are tight, and profit margins are thin. So even a temporary disruption, like thousands of fishing boats blocking the way, immediately translates to costs, travel delays, route changes, higher fuel consumption, and most of all, uncertainty. Because if they don't know when it will happen again, it makes planning even harder for shipping companies. And beyond the immediate effects, there's now a bigger question that governments and businesses in the region are facing. What will happen next? The East China Sea is one of the most important trade routes, especially for Japan and South Korea, two of the largest economies in the world. If Beijing can deploy more than 1,000 ships in the middle of the sea and keep them there for 30 hours, they can do it again. and possibly for even longer, more dangerously, and possibly even closer to critical choke points. And when that happens, the effects won't just be felt in the Pacific. The Japan question. And when it comes to Japan, there's another important detail that we haven't mentioned yet. The gathering of the Chinese Maritime Militia happened during a time of escalating diplomatic tensions between Tokyo and Beijing. On November 7, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida told Japan's parliament that a Chinese naval blockade or the use of military forces against Taiwan could be considered a situation that threatens the very safety of Japan. This means they could use their right to self-defense to help Taiwan. And as expected, Beijing reacted strongly. Furious, high-ranking Chinese officials demanded that Japan retract the statement, but Japan refused. And that's where one of the worst diplomatic rifts between the two countries in recent times began. And after that, a massive deployment in the East China Sea. According to regional security officials who spoke to Reuters, Beijing began sending more forces to the region after they summoned Japan's ambassador on November 14 to protest Kishida's statement. Soon after, formations of maritime militia followed. And according to the Institute for the Study of War, it's possible that Beijing itself chose their locations to send a clear message not only to Japan but also to Taiwan. And this is where things get more serious. For Japan, the possible invasion of Taiwan is no longer a distant threat. This is something that could happen in the near future and would have a serious impact on Tokyo. In 2023, former CIA Director William Burns said there was intelligence indicating that Xi Jinping had ordered the Chinese military to be ready for a successful invasion by 2027. That is getting closer and closer. But it's important to clarify that according to a more recent assessment by the U.S. intelligence community, Beijing does not have a concrete plan to carry out the invasion in 2027, nor do they have a definite timeline for unification. For Washington, that might be good news. But for Japan, it's not very reassuring, because their tensions with China are not just about Taiwan. They've had a long-standing dispute over a group of islands in the East China Sea, the Senkaku Islands. Japan controls them, but China and Taiwan also claim them. And it's not just about land. The area is believed to be rich in fish, oil, and natural gas. That's why this has been an increasingly heated issue for decades. And you can see how serious China is about this matter through their actions. In January, the head of the Chinese Coast Guard, Wang Zhongming, said that in the past 5 years, they have conducted 134 patrols around the Senkaku Islands, with a total deployment of 550,000 vessels and 6,000 aircraft. And in 2025 alone, they patrolled for 357 days, almost every day. And it doesn't end there. In the middle of March 2026, vessels of the Chinese Coast Guard entered waters claimed by Japan while chasing a Japanese fishing boat. 2 vessels approached within 12 nautical miles of Minami-Kojima, one of the islands, and they stayed there for more than a day. The next day, 4 ships entered again, and the incident lasted for almost 2 hours. According to the Japanese Coast Guard, it is unclear why that happened, especially since there were no fishing boats in the area at that time. And this is where the situation becomes complicated for Japan, because they have very few good options. The Senkaku Islands are part of what is called the First Island Chain, a chain of islands from Japan, Taiwan, to the Philippines that serves as a barrier to China's expanding maritime power. And what Beijing is doing is maintaining just enough presence to challenge Japan's control, but not to the point of causing a direct war. A very cautious move, because with every incursion they make, Japan is forced to respond. And with every response, Japan's time, attention, and resources are gradually being depleted. According to Robert Ward, Japan chair of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, China has expanded its pressure into more areas. He told the BBC that Beijing is using a strategy similar to what is called gray zone warfare. It's a tactic that gradually wears down the opponent until things that are actually not normal start to seem normal. China's actions include filing a complaint with the United Nations, postponing the trilateral summit with Japan and South Korea, and trying to convince other countries to side with them. They urged the UK and France to support them, while encouraging their allies like Russia and North Korea to condemn Japan. For Tokyo, the situation has become so tense that, according to Reuters, some officials are quietly encouraging fishermen to just avoid the disputed islands. Imagine that. It's your own territory, but you're telling your own citizens to avoid it. The combination of militia exercises, the issue with Taiwan, and the ongoing tension in the Senkaku Islands puts Japan in a very difficult position, as if different pressure points are being pressed all at once. And this is getting worse because of a critical weakness of Japan. This is their heavy dependence on imported energy to satisfy their local demand. Before the Fukushima nuclear disaster, about 30% of the country's electricity came from nuclear power. But after the meltdown, they had to completely stop this, and because of that, they became even more dependent on external sources. By 2023, it is estimated that 22% of all global LNG imports go to Japan. According to the Center for Maritime Strategy, almost 70% of the country's energy imports pass through sensitive choke points, including the Strait of Malacca, South China Sea, East China Sea, and the waters near Taiwan. And if even one of these routes is delayed, even slightly, the impact will be significant. Japan has no international oil or gas pipelines. And unlike oil, which can be stockpiled for several months, LNG can only be stored for a limited period. In fact, according to Japan's trade minister, Ryosei Akazawa, their LNG reserves are only enough for about 3 weeks, while their oil reserves can last much longer. And if that natural gas runs out, Tokyo could experience consecutive brownouts, factory shutdowns, and extreme cold in homes. The wider region. It's not just Japan and Taiwan that are worried. Across the region, more and more countries are getting anxious about China's growing assertiveness, not just in the East China Sea, but throughout the entire Indo-Pacific. The Philippines has long faced tensions with China in the South China Sea, where Beijing uses ramming, water cannons, and blockades to challenge Manila's presence in the disputed reefs. South Korea, which shares a maritime boundary with China in the Yellow Sea, and is home to about 28,500 American troops, has also experienced worsening relations with Beijing in recent years, from issues of missile defense to overfishing. And even though relations have somewhat improved recently, especially after the election of Lee Jae-myung, Seoul still has enough reason to be cautious with China. In fact, most of these countries rely on the United States as the main guarantor of their security against possible aggression from China. And now, that trust is being tested because of the war in Iran. As we mentioned earlier, America's stockpile of missile interceptors is gradually being depleted. But what we haven't discussed yet is that it has reached the point where they need to transfer some defense systems from Asia to the Middle East. This includes the Patriot and THAAD air defense batteries that were transferred from South Korea. This was confirmed by Lee Jae-myung himself, who said that even though Seoul is opposed, they can't do much about it. And that's not all. According to photos from the U.S. military, weren't the 2 U.S. destroyers based in Japan sent to join the strikes against Iran? Even the guided bomb kits and Army tactical missile systems have also been moved out of the region. Because of this, more and more defense officials in Asia are becoming concerned. What they fear is that if the war drags on, even more American forces could be moved out of the Indo-Pacific. And even if the fighting ends soon, it will take several years to replenish the depleted weapons. This means Taiwan and other flashpoints in the region will be left more exposed. Washington tried to ease these concerns. In a Senate hearing, Elbridge Colby said that America is still focused on engaging with its allies in the Indo-Pacific. According to him, we are laser-focused on the first island. But even with statements like this, there are problems that cannot be solved by words alone. According to Rommel Jude Ong, a retired Rear Admiral of the Philippine Navy, the current presence of the U.S. Navy is very important to prevent China from taking control of the South China Sea. And the truth is, even before the war in Iran, China already had more maritime forces in East Asia compared to the United States. So if the U.S. presence in the region is reduced even further, The gap will only get bigger, and it could possibly get even worse. For now, the war in Iran remains an exchange of airstrikes, with no ground invasion yet. But if the conflict escalates further, other U.S. military forces based in the Pacific could get involved, including Marine Corps units in Japan, and this has happened before. During previous wars in the Middle East, the U.S. removed some military assets from East Asia, including the USS George Washington, which was temporarily relocated from Japan during the Afghanistan campaign. At that time, it wasn't much of a problem because China's military capability wasn't that strong yet. But now, it's a different story. If the White House repeats this move in the current situation, it could have serious consequences. According to Hirohito Ogi, a former official of the Japanese Defense Ministry, if a major asset like the USS George Washington is once again deployed to the Middle East, it will be a problem for the readiness of the Indo-Pacific. Although he said that this is not very likely to happen, the more immediate concern is the depletion of missiles, especially the Patriot interceptors, because the truth is, it takes a long time to make these. And when we say a long time, it really means a long time. According to the Payne Institute, the U.S. used more than 300 Patriot and other interceptors within just the first 36 hours of the war in Iran. And in addition to that, 280 were used by the Gulf countries. This means that in just a day and a half, several hundred missiles were already used up. And at the time of writing this, the war has already lasted for 3 weeks. And there are still no signs that it will end soon. Meanwhile, Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer of Patriot missiles, can only produce around 620 per year. Let's just say that the Pentagon really does have a plan to increase this, up to 2,000 per year within 7 years. But that won't be reached until 2030, so even if production increases, it will still take several years to replenish the depleted stockpiles, not just of America, but also of its allies in the Middle East. And because of this, countries in the Indo-Pacific will also take several years before they can recover. According to Grant Newsham, a former U.S. Marine Corps colonel and liaison officer to the Japanese military, this is the result of what's called the just-in-time approach, a system based on the belief that America will never again face a major war, especially two at the same time. But now, clearly, the reality is different. And whatever the reason, the outcome is the same. America's allies in the Indo-Pacific are feeling anxious. Meanwhile, China seems to be growing even more confident, enough to deploy ships in formations stretching up to 400 kilometers long, capable of affecting major shipping routes, while their Coast Guard chases Japanese fishermen away from islands controlled by Tokyo. And Washington, despite statements that they are focused on the first island chain, seems too preoccupied with the war in Iran to give enough attention to the Indo-Pacific. And if this continues, the next boat swarm might not be 300 kilometers away from Taiwan anymore. This could happen right in front of Taiwan, or perhaps near the coast of Japan, South Korea, or even the Philippines. And if that happens, there's one question we need to think about. Are we ready? Because if not, the next move at sea might not just be a simple show of force by our neighbor. Instead, it could be the beginning of a bigger and more dangerous conflict.